Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of New Mexico. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. It began with nothing more than a handwritten advertisement posted in the Las Vegas Daily Gazette on April 17, 1883. Widow Clark's Inn now open for business. Fine dining and lodging on the old Santa Fe Trail, 3 miles east of the plaza. Reasonable rates for distinguished guests. The notice was small, just a few lines tucked between advertisements for patent medicines and listings of cattle sales. Perhaps that's why it drew so little attention at first. Las Vegas, New Mexico Territory, 1883. The railroad had arrived 4 years earlier, transforming what had once been a small Mexican settlement into a booming frontier town. The plaza area, with its adobe buildings, still retained the character of Old Town, while New Town had sprung up around the railroad depot a mile to the east. The town had become notorious for harboring outlaws and desperados, men who drifted in from the plains seeking fortune or escape from their pasts. Among the many businesses that appeared that spring was Widow Clark's Inn, a 2-story wooden structure built on the remains of an old trading post along the Santa Fe Trail. It stood alone on the prairie, approximately 3 miles east of town, positioned perfectly to catch travelers coming from the east before they reached the relative civilization of Las Vegas proper. The widow herself was a mystery. Some said she had arrived from Boston after losing her husband to consumption. Others claimed she was from Virginia, a war widow who had come west to escape painful memories. No one seemed to know for certain, and Mrs. Abigail Clark was not forthcoming about her past. She was a tall, slender woman, perhaps 50 years of age, with gray-streaked hair always pulled tight into a severe bun. Her face possessed a curiously ageless quality, pale and smooth, with only the faintest lines around her gray eyes. Marshal James Wilcox later noted in his official report that the widow had purchased the property in February from a Mr. Theodore Hampton, paying in cash with gold coins that Hampton described as old and foreign-looking. Hampton had been eager to sell, as the isolated location had proven unprofitable for his own failed attempt at a way station. The sale was recorded at the county courthouse on February 23, 1883. The deed transferred to Abigail Clark, widow. The inn itself was unremarkable from the outside, weathered clapboard siding, a broad porch facing the road, and a hand-painted sign swinging from a post, Widow Clark's Inn, fine food and lodging. What distinguished it was its stone foundation and cellar, remnants of the original trading post that had stood on the site since the 1840s. The widow had employed several Mexican laborers from Las Vegas to repair the foundation and expand the cellar considerably, though what purpose such an expansion might serve was unclear. Perhaps what most distinguished Widow Clark from other new business proprietors in the area was her apparent wealth, displayed with a subtle restraint that only made it more noticeable. Her clothing, while all was black in keeping with her widowed status, was of fine quality. The furnishings she brought to the inn, delivered by wagon from the railroad depot, included pieces that locals recognized as expensive and Eastern in origin. Crystal glassware, silver place settings, and fine china were unloaded under her careful supervision. Such luxuries were rarely seen in this part of New Mexico, particularly at a roadside inn. According to town records, the inn opened quietly in early April. The first documented guests were a cattle buyer named Philip Latimer and his clerk, Thomas Reed, who stopped there on April 10th while traveling from Kansas City. Neither man was ever seen again after checking into the inn. Their disappearance might have gone unnoticed, except that Latimer was expected in Santa Fe to complete a significant cattle purchase. When he failed to arrive, telegrams were sent to Las Vegas inquiring about his whereabouts. Marshal Wilcox recalled visiting the inn on April 19th to inquire about Latimer. The widow informed me that the gentlemen had taken their supper, stayed the night, and departed early the next morning, continuing on towards Santa Fe, he wrote in his report. She seemed perfectly at ease, even offering me coffee and pie, which I declined. The inn appeared to be in good order, quiet, with no other guests present at that time. I had no reason to doubt her account. Had Wilcox accepted that coffee and pie, perhaps the subsequent events might have been avoided. Perhaps not. The disappearance of Latimer and Reed was not immediately linked to any foul play. In 1883, men frequently vanished in the territories for any number of reasons. They might have been robbed and killed by bandits elsewhere on the trail. They might have changed their plans and diverted to Colorado without notice. They might have fallen victim to the harsh landscape itself. A wrong turn in a sudden storm could leave travelers lost and dying of thirst in the unforgiving terrain just beyond the civilized boundaries. What we know with certainty is that on April 22nd, a stagecoach carrying mail and 3 passengers stopped at the inn. The driver, a veteran of the trail named Samuel Wilson, later told Marshal Wilcox that his passengers had gone inside for a meal while he tended to the horses. When he entered the dining room 40 minutes later, he found them uncommonly pleased with their meal, all 3 commenting on the exceptional quality of the food. One of those passengers, a drummer selling dry goods named Michael Fletcher, later wrote to his company in St. Louis, "The meal at the widow's establishment was remarkable, unlike anything I've tasted on the frontier. She served a stew with flavors so rich and complex that I found myself eating well beyond the point of satiety. There was something almost intoxicating about it. I purchased some small cakes for the journey, which the other passengers and I consumed with similar enthusiasm." Throughout late April and May, the widow's establishment developed a curious reputation. Travelers reported that the food was extraordinary, unlike anything available in Las Vegas proper. A stagecoach driver named William Harrison described the fare as remarkably flavorful with spices I couldn't place, though I've eaten in fine establishments from St. Louis to San Francisco. What drew particular notice was that Widow Clark prepared all meals herself, refusing to employ a cook. She did have 2 assistants, a mute Mexican woman, known only as Elena, who cleaned the rooms, and a taciturn stable hand called Joseph, who tended to guests' horses and handled heavy work around the property. Neither ever spoke to guests, and both lived in small rooms at the back of the property. On May 2nd, another incident occurred that, in retrospect, should have raised concerns. A prospector returning from the mountains stopped at the inn for a meal. According to his account, given weeks later to a bartender in Santa Fe, he had found the dining room empty, except for a single gentleman in a fine suit, who sat alone at a table, not eating but staring blankly at the wall. When the widow emerged from the kitchen, the prospector claimed the seated man's demeanor changed immediately. His back straightened, his eyes focused, and he began to eat mechanically from an empty plate with precise, deliberate movements. The prospector, unsettled by this strange behavior, made excuses about needing to continue his journey and left without eating. He claimed that as he mounted his horse, he glanced back to see the widow watching him from the porch, her expression one of cold calculation, like a hunter assessing prey that has slipped from the trap. During this period, at least 2 other travelers disappeared after reportedly stopping at the inn, a land speculator from Chicago named Richard Barton, and a young man identified only as Jenkins in Marshal Wilcox's records, who had been traveling west to meet his brother in California. In both cases, inquiries from family members or business associates eventually reached Las Vegas, where Marshal Wilcox noted their last known whereabouts as Widow Clark's Inn. Each time Wilcox questioned the widow, her response was the same. The men had dined, perhaps stayed the night, and continued on their way. Without evidence to contradict her account, and with disappearances being relatively common on the frontier, no formal investigation was launched. By June, the inn had become something of an open secret among certain circles in Las Vegas, a place known for exceptional dining, though the widow was selective about whom she welcomed. The Las Vegas Daily Gazette mentioned the establishment once more on June 2nd, noting that Mrs. Clark's Country Inn has become a fashionable destination for those with discerning palates, though reservations must be secured in advance. What the notice didn't mention was that by early June, The widow had begun hosting private dinner parties for the more prominent citizens of Las Vegas. These were exclusive affairs, by invitation only, with never more than 8 guests at a time. Those who received such invitations spoke of them with a strange mixture of pride and secretiveness, as if being chosen marked them as special in some indefinable way. What followed next comes primarily from the journal of Dr. Edward Blackwood, a physician who had recently arrived in Las Vegas to establish a practice. His journal, discovered in 1968 during renovations to the Las Vegas courthouse, provides the most complete account of the peculiar events that summer. On June 18th, Blackwood wrote that he had been invited to a special dinner at Widow Clark's Inn by Judge Samuel Pendergast, a prominent Las Vegas citizen. The judge insists that I must experience Mrs. Clark's culinary artistry, he noted. Apparently, she is hosting a special dinner for 8 guests this Saturday evening. The judge was most insistent, claiming her meals are transformative experiences. I admit I am curious, as I have heard others speak of the widow's establishment in near reverent tones. The dinner was scheduled for June 23rd. Blackwood's journal entry from that morning reveals some hesitation. I find myself strangely apprehensive about this evening's engagement. Last night I dreamed of a long table set with silver and crystal, but the food served consisted of strange, pulsating meats that seemed almost alive. Judge Pendergast was there, his mouth stretched impossibly wide to accommodate the writhing portions on his plate. I attribute this disturbing imagery to overwork and perhaps the lurid dime novels I've been reading before bed. Still, I cannot shake a sense of foreboding. Despite his misgivings, Blackwood attended the dinner. The other guests included Judge Pendergast and his wife Martha, Harold Winters, the banker, Thomas and Elizabeth Collins, who owned the mercantile store in Newtown, and Mayor Frederick Wilson and his daughter Clara, a young widow herself who had recently returned to Las Vegas following her husband's death in Denver. In his detailed account, written the following morning, Blackwood described the inn as tastefully appointed, with quality furnishings that seemed oddly out of place, so far from civilization. The dining room featured a long oak table that could seat 12, set with fine china, crystal, and silver that would not have been out of place in a Boston mansion. The windows were covered with heavy velvet drapes that blocked all outside light, while ornate oil lamps cast a warm glow throughout the room. Widow Clark greeted them dressed in a black gown of expensive cut. Her only ornament, a peculiar silver brooch at her throat in the shape of what Blackwood described as a stylized hand clutching what appeared to be a small, anatomically correct heart. Throughout the evening, Blackwood wrote, our hostess was gracious and articulate, revealing an education and refinement that raised further questions about her background. When Mayor Wilson inquired directly about her origins, she smiled and said only, we are all transformed by our journeys, are we not? What matters is not where we began, but what we have become. The topic was not raised again. The meal consisted of 7 courses, each more extraordinary than the last. Blackwood, who had dined in fine establishments in Boston during his medical training, confessed that he had never experienced such flavors, complex, exotic, almost intoxicating. The main course was described as a roast of unusual character that the widow called simply house specialty. While the meat resembled beef in some respects, Blackwood noted, its texture and flavor were unlike anything I had previously encountered. Mrs. Clark mentioned only that it was locally sourced and required special preparation to bring out its unique qualities. I found myself consuming it with an almost unseemly eagerness, as did the other guests. What Blackwood found particularly notable was the widow's attention to each guest's reaction to the food. She watched us eat with an intensity that would have been inappropriate in other circumstances, he wrote. Her eyes seemed to glitter with satisfaction as Judge Pendergast closed his eyes in apparent ecstasy after tasting the main course, and again when Mrs. Collins uttered a small moan of pleasure while consuming the dessert. Throughout the evening, Blackwood observed that the widow served different wines with each course, though he noted that she herself drank only water from a silver goblet. By the time dessert was served, a rich, dark pudding with the faint metallic sweetness of blood oranges, Blackwood reported feeling a curious lightness of head and heaviness of limb. His account continues. As the evening progressed, conversation grew increasingly animated yet strangely disconnected. Judge Pendergast, ordinarily the most proper of men, began relating inappropriate anecdotes that caused his wife visible distress. Mrs. Collins removed her shawl, complaining of heat despite the cool evening, revealing more of her bosom than propriety would dictate. Mayor Wilson's speech became slurred, though he had consumed no more wine than the rest of us. Throughout these increasingly peculiar interactions, Widow Clark watched us with an expression I can only describe as hungry, not in the common usage of the term, but as if she were consuming something invisible that emanated from our increasingly uninhibited behavior. When Clara Wilson suddenly began weeping for no apparent reason, our hostess's eyes seemed to gleam with satisfaction. By Blackwood's estimation, it was nearly midnight when the widow suggested they retire to the parlor for coffee. I found myself struggling to rise from my chair, my coordination oddly affected, he wrote. Looking around the table, I observed that the others appeared similarly afflicted. Mrs. Collins had laid her head upon the table, as if asleep. Mr. Winters was staring vacantly at his empty plate, a line of saliva trailing from his lower lip. What happened next is where Blackwood's account becomes most disturbing. He reports that as he struggled to maintain his composure, the widow moved behind Judge Pendergast's chair and placed her hands on his shoulders. The judge, who had fallen silent, showed no reaction. With a strength that seemed impossible for a woman of her frame, Blackwood wrote, she pulled the judge's head back and bent to whisper something in his ear. Though I could not hear the words, I observed with horror that her tongue appeared unnaturally long and sinuous as it nearly entered the judge's ear canal. More disturbing still was the judge's reaction. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites, while his mouth opened in what could have been either ecstasy or agony. Blackwood claims that at this point he attempted to stand, recognizing that something was terribly wrong, but found himself unable to coordinate his movements. The room began to spin, and he lost consciousness. His next clear memory was of waking at dawn, lying fully clothed on his bed in his quarters in Las Vegas, with no recollection of how he had returned to town. My mouth tastes of copper and ash, he wrote. My head throbs abominably. Most disturbing is a small wound on my inner forearm that resembles a surgical incision, approximately 1 inch in length, neatly sutured with what appears to be surgical silk. I have no memory of receiving such a wound, nor of treating it myself. Blackwood immediately went to Judge Pendergast's home, concerned about the others from the dinner party. He found the house empty, with no sign of the judge or Mrs. Pendergast. Increasingly alarmed, he checked on the other guests and discovered that none of them had returned to their homes. Finally, he went to Marshal Wilcox to report the strange events and his concerns. According to Wilcox's official report, dated June 24, 1883, he initially dismissed Blackwood's account as the result of overindulgence. The doctor appeared agitated and unwell, Wilcox wrote. His story of strange foods, drugged wine, and the widow's unusual behavior seemed the product of intoxication and perhaps an overactive imagination. Nevertheless, when he insisted that 7 prominent citizens remained unaccounted for, I agreed to accompany him to the inn to investigate. What they found, or rather, didn't find at Widow Clark's inn, forms the central mystery of this account. According to both Blackwood's journal and Wilcox's report, when they arrived at the location where the inn had stood, they discovered only a burned-out shell. The wooden structure had been completely consumed by fire, with only the stone foundation and cellar remaining. The ashes were still warm, Wilcox noted, indicating the fire had occurred within the past several hours. Yet no one had reported seeing smoke or flames, despite the inn's location being visible from the eastern approach to town. Upon examining the ruins, they found no human remains in the main structure. However, in a small outbuilding, that had escaped the fire, they discovered the body of Joseph, the stable hand. His throat had been cut with such force that he was nearly decapitated. Of Elena, the mute Mexican woman, they found no trace. Most disturbing was what they discovered in the cellar. The stone-walled space was much larger than it appeared from outside, extending well beyond the footprint of the inn above. Wilcox's report describes a chamber that more resembled a butcher's abattoir than a root cellar. Iron hooks hung from the ceiling beams. A large drain occupied the center of the stone floor. Various implements, knives, saws, and cleavers, were arranged neatly on a wooden workbench along one wall. The entire space had been scrubbed clean, Wilcox wrote, yet the drain retained traces of what Dr. Blackwood identified as blood, apparently washed down in great quantities. The walls, too, bore stains that had resisted cleaning, suggesting repeated splatter and subsequent cleaning over time. In a smaller adjoining chamber, they found several trunks containing women's clothing of various sizes and styles, jewelry, and personal items, including diaries and letters addressed to different names, none of them Abigail Clark. More ominously, they discovered a collection of pocket watches, cufflinks, and other masculine personal effects, some inscribed with the names or initials of men who had been reported missing over the previous months. Most damning was a leather-bound ledger in which neat, feminine handwriting recorded dates, names, and cryptic notation such as quality marbling, excellent flavor, and tender, but lacking character. The final entry, dated June 23rd, listed all 8 dinner guests, including Dr. Blackwood, with the notation, 7 harvested, 1 seeded for future propagation. Of Widow Clark herself, they found no trace. No body, no personal belongings that could be definitively linked to her. She had vanished as completely as her dinner guests. The investigation that followed revealed other disturbing details. Records in Las Vegas and Santa Fe showed that no Abigail Clark had arrived on any stage or train. The gold coins she had used to purchase the property were eventually identified as Spanish doubloons, at least a century old. Most significant was the discovery that similar patterns of disappearances had occurred in Dodge City, Kansas in 1879 and Denver in 1881, and would later be documented in Tucson in 1885, each following the establishment of a boarding, house or inn, run by a widow whose description matched that of Abigail Clark. As the investigation expanded, Marshal Wilcox telegraphed inquiries to law enforcement officials throughout the territories and states. The responses painted a disturbing picture that extended beyond the recent incidents. In St. Louis, records from 1872 described the brief operation of a boarding house run by a Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, no relation to the doctor, where 3 businessmen had disappeared. In San Francisco in 1868, a Mrs. Victoria Chambers had opened a small hotel catering to gold merchants. During the 6 months of its operation, 5 men of substantial means had vanished without trace. In each case, the establishment had operated for less than a year before its proprietress disappeared following inquiries into missing persons. In each case, the woman was described as tall, slender, with prematurely gray-streaked dark hair, and possessing an unusual silver brooch. But perhaps most chilling was a report from New Orleans dating back to 1857. A Madame Clarisse had opened an exclusive dining establishment in the French Quarter, catering to wealthy planters and merchants. After 8 months and 11 disappearances, suspicious neighbors had broken into the property one night, only to find it completely empty. The furniture, decorations, even the proprietress herself gone without trace. In the basement, however, they discovered an arrangement similar to what Wilcox found in Las Vegas: hooks, drainage, specialized tools, and evidence of blood, despite thorough cleaning. A journalist for the New Orleans Picayune had written at the time, "What manner of monster has been among us, feasting not only upon the flesh of her victims, but upon their terror and helplessness as well?" For surely no human agency could account for the complete disappearance of 11 substantial gentlemen, leaving neither trace nor remains to mark their passing. The Picayune article included an artist's rendering of Madame Clarisse, based on neighbors' descriptions. Though the fashions were different, the face staring from the yellowed newspaper was unmistakably that of Widow Clark. As for Dr. Blackwood, his journal entries become increasingly paranoid in the weeks following the incident. He became convinced that he had been allowed to survive for some specific purpose. The sutured incision on his arm healed, but he reported recurrent dreams in which something moves beneath the skin, as if a foreign body were inserted that now grows and changes within me. On July 3rd, just over a week after the dinner party, Blackwood wrote, "I find myself thinking constantly of food. Not ordinary sustenance, but elaborate preparations that come to me in dreams. Last night I envisioned a particular preparation involving the liver, where it must be removed while still pulsing with life, then marinated in a solution of rare herbs and the tears of its former owner. I awoke with my mouth watering. God help me. By July 7th, his entries had become more disturbed. I cannot sleep for the hunger. Not an ordinary hunger of the stomach, but something deeper, more primal. I catch myself watching the people of Las Vegas as they go about their business, assessing them not as patients or fellow citizens, but as ingredients. Mrs. Thornton, the baker's wife, has arms that would yield the most tender meat, properly braised. Young Thomas at the livery stable has the clear eyes of youth that would make an exquisite appetizer, preserved in vinegar and certain spices that I somehow know precisely without ever having learned them. On July 10th, Blackwood recorded a disturbing incident. I was called to the Rodriguez home to treat their youngest son for fever. As I bent over the child to examine him, I found myself overwhelmed by a hunger so profound that I cannot commit even to these private pages what I contemplated. I fled the house, making excuses about needing medications from my office, and have sent word that I myself have taken ill and cannot attend patients for some days. I must understand what is happening to me. I must resist. His final entry, dated July 11th, reads simply, "I understand now what she meant by seeded. I feel her hunger growing within me. God help those who cross my path when it fully awakens." On July the 12th, less than 3 weeks after the dinner at Widow Clark's Inn, Edward Blackwood disappeared from Las Vegas. His quarters were found undisturbed, with no sign of struggle or packing for a journey. The only item missing was his medical bag. Marshal Wilcox, now deeply concerned about the implications of the widow's ledger notation regarding Blackwood, organized a search party. They found nothing, though a stagecoach driver reported seeing a man matching the doctor's description walking alone on the Santa Fe Road, heading south. When asked if he had offered the man a ride, the driver replied, "There was something about his expression that made me keep the horses moving. He was smiling, but not with his eyes, if you take my meaning." 2 days later, a family of Mexican farmers discovered Blackwood's medical bag abandoned beside a small stream approximately 15 miles south of Las Vegas. The bag contained his standard medical instruments, plus several unusual implements that one of the searchers, a butcher by trade, identified as specialized knives for particular cuts of meat. Of Blackwood himself, no further trace was ever found. However, over the next 2 months, 3 travelers were reported missing along the road between Las Vegas and Santa Fe. In each case, witnesses reported seeing the travelers in conversation with a well-dressed gentleman who matched Blackwood's description shortly before their disappearances. The case of Widow Clark's Inn was never officially solved. The disappearances were eventually attributed to an unknown person or persons who had murdered the prominent citizens and burned the evidence. Without bodies, there could be no proper investigation or closure for the families. By year's end, the incident had faded from local conversation, becoming just another dark chapter in Las Vegas's violent frontier history. In 1885, a physician named Edward Clark established a practice in Tucson, Arizona. He was described as courteous and skilled, though somewhat reserved. He lived alone and was known for hosting occasional dinner parties for selected patients and prominent citizens, where the food was said to be extraordinary. During the 18 months of his residence in Tucson, 11 people disappeared without trace. When authorities eventually connected the disappearances to Dr. Clark, they found his home abandoned, with a cellar containing the now familiar arrangement of hooks, drainage, and specialized implements. An elderly Navajo woman who had worked as a housekeeper for Clark told investigators that her employer had maintained a strict rule that she was never to enter the cellar or to be present during his dinner parties. She also mentioned that despite his apparent youth, Dr. Clark's dark hair was already streaked with gray, and that he wore a curious silver brooch in the shape of a hand clutching a heart when not seeing patients. When shown a photograph of Edward Blackwood that Marshall Wilcox had circulated throughout the territories, she identified him without hesitation as Dr. Clark. In 1889, a similar pattern of disappearances occurred in Seattle, Washington, linked to the establishment of an exclusive restaurant operated by Mrs. Eliza Carrington, described as a tall, slender, prematurely graying widow of refined manners. By the time authorities connected the 7 disappearances to her establishment, she had vanished. In the basement, they found the same configuration as in Las Vegas and Tucson. In 1893 in Chicago, a physician named Edgar Blackwood Clark opened a practice near the grounds of the World's Columbian Exposition. Over the 6 months of the fair, 16 visitors disappeared after reportedly consulting Dr. Clark about minor ailments. When police finally investigated his offices, they found them empty, with a hidden cellar room containing the familiar evidence of butchery. A building janitor reported that Dr. Clark had worn a silver pin on his lapel in the shape of a hand clutching a heart. The pattern continued, moving across the country with variations, but always maintaining key elements: a widow or doctor of distinctive appearance, exceptional food or medical care that drew selected victims, and the subsequent disappearance of both victims and perpetrator, leaving behind only the evidence of a specialized slaughter room. The locations changed, as did the names and sometimes the gender of the predator, but the methodology remained consistent. In 1907, a shepherd discovered a series of unusual stone cairns in a remote arroyo approximately 10 miles southeast of where Widow Clark's Inn had stood. Beneath each cairn were human remains, partial skeletons showing evidence of peculiar preparation. The bones had been neatly stripped of flesh, with precise cut marks suggesting butchery rather than decomposition or animal scavenging. A report was filed with the territorial authorities, but no connection was made to the events of 1883. The site was re-examined in 1968 by archaeologists from the University of New Mexico, who carbon dated the remains to the late 19th century. Among the artifacts recovered was a silver brooch in the shape of a hand clutching a heart. The brooch was placed in storage at the university's anthropology department, but disappeared from its cataloged location in 1969. The graduate student who had been examining it, a woman named Ellen Clark, disappeared at the same time. The foundations of Widow Clark's Inn remained visible for decades, a crumbling reminder of tragedy that locals tended to avoid, especially after dark. Children dared each other to spend the night there, though few accepted the challenge, and those who did reported strange dreams of hunger and whispered recipes. In 1925, a teenage boy who had been challenged to spend the night in the ruins was found the next morning wandering the road to Las Vegas, unable to speak coherently except to mutter repeatedly about the woman in the cellar and the taste of forever. In 1962, the land was purchased by a development company from California, with plans to build a motel catering to travelers on the newly constructed interstate. During excavation, workers expanded the old cellar and discovered a hidden chamber sealed behind a false wall. According to the foreman's statement, within this space, they found a collection of jars containing preserved human organs, each labeled with a date corresponding to the spring and summer of 1883. Construction was immediately halted, and authorities were contacted, but when county officials arrived the following day, both the chamber and its contents had vanished. 3 workers involved in the discovery failed to report for work that morning and were never seen again. The development was abandoned, and the land remained vacant until 1998, when it was incorporated into a ranch property. The current owners have reported no unusual occurrences, though they chose to fill in the old cellar and foundation rather than build over it. The rancher told a local historian, "Something about that ground ain't right. Cattle won't graze near it. Birds don't sing there. Even the rattlesnakes stay clear. Some places are just best left alone." In the archives of Marshall Wilcox, discovered after his death in 1901, researchers found a personal journal separate from his official reports. In an entry dated December 18, 1883, nearly 6 months after the Widow Clark incident, he wrote, "I dream of her still, not as a woman, but as something wearing a woman's shape. In the dreams, she is feeding me something dark and sweet from her own hand, and though I try to resist, my mouth waters and opens of its own accord. I wake with a taste of copper in my mouth and the certainty that something fundamental has changed within me. I find myself noticing things about the people of Las Vegas that I never observed before: the marbling of fat beneath Mrs. Henderson's skin, the tender quality that regular horseback riding gives to the flesh of young men. These are not natural thoughts. I shall destroy this journal before these notions take deeper root." Evidently, he did not carry through with this intention. The journal continues for another 18 months, with entries becoming increasingly preoccupied with detailed descriptions of citizens in terms of their potential culinary qualities. The entries stop abruptly in June 1885. According to town records, Marshall Wilcox resigned his position that month, citing ill health, and left Las Vegas. No record of his subsequent activities or final fate has ever been found. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports that emerge every few years from different locations across the Southwest: Santa Fe, Taos, Flagstaff, Sedona, of a restaurant or small inn operated by a solitary woman where the food is described as unlike anything you've ever tasted. These establishments appear suddenly, operate for a brief period, and close without notice, often coinciding with the disappearance of one or more local residents or travelers. In 1931, an elderly man in a Denver nursing home claimed to be Thomas Reed, the clerk who had disappeared with cattle buyer Philip Latimer from Widow Clark's Inn in April 1883. The man, who had been admitted under the name Thomas Smith, began making these claims during episodes of delirium. The attending physician, Dr. Helen Carter, documented his statements out of clinical interest in his delusions. According to Dr. Carter's notes, the man described being held captive in the cellar of Widow Clark's Inn for several days, during which time he witnessed the methodical butchering of Latimer. "She prepared different parts in different ways," he reportedly said, "some slow-cooked, some cured with salt, some pickled in brine. Nothing wasted. She fed me morsels, saying that the life essence is enhanced when the meat is consumed by one who knew the source in life." The man claimed he had been kept alive to absorb the essence of Latimer through these forced meals, after which the widow cut a small incision in his arm and inserted something like a seed, but pulsing with its own life. He escaped during the confusion of a kitchen fire that he himself had set, fleeing westward into the mountains rather than back toward Las Vegas, out of fear that she would sense my direction if I took the expected path. For decades afterward, he claimed he could feel the seed growing within him, creating unnatural hungers that he fought through isolation, prayer, and a strictly vegetarian diet. "It wants meat," he told Dr. Carter. "Specifically, it wants human meat prepared in her special ways. The recipes come to me in dreams, complete with ingredients and techniques I could never have known. When I resist, it punishes me with pain and nightmares of being eaten alive myself." Dr. Carter initially diagnosed the man as suffering from late-stage syphilitic dementia. However, her notes indicate growing uncertainty about this diagnosis, as his laboratory results failed to confirm the presence of the disease. She also documented an unusual growth on his forearm at the location where he claimed the seed had been inserted. When she attempted to examine this growth, the patient became violently agitated, insisting that it must never be disturbed. The man died 3 weeks after admission. Dr. Carter conducted an unauthorized examination of the growth on his arm. describing it in her private notes as a hard, nodular mass approximately the size of a walnut, with numerous filamentous projections extending into the surrounding tissue. When dissected, the center was found to contain a small, dark object resembling a desiccated seed, surrounded by a gelatinous material of unknown composition. Dr. Carter preserved this object in a specimen jar for further study. 3 days later, she disappeared from the hospital without explanation. The specimen was never found. The most recent documented incident connected to the Widow Clark pattern came from a small town outside Albuquerque in 1967, where a bed and breakfast operated briefly under the name Abigail's. Table. The proprietress was described as an elegant older woman who didn't look her. Age. After 6 months and 3 unsolved disappearances, the establishment closed overnight. Left behind was a single piece of paper, a page apparently torn from a ledger, containing a list of names with annotations about quality and flavor. Most disturbing was the notation beside the final entry, which read, "Michael Burnett, saved for propagation, exceptionally pure essence." Burnett, a 32-year-old English professor from the University of New Mexico who had been reported missing 3 days earlier, was found wandering along Highway 25 2 weeks later. He had no memory of where he had been or what had happened to him. Doctors at the Albuquerque General Hospital noted a small, precisely sutured incision on his left forearm, but could determine no medical purpose for it. Burnett was released after a week of observation, during which time he exhibited no unusual behaviors beyond an uncharacteristic interest in rare cooking techniques, which he attributed to reading he had done while recuperating. 6 months later, Burnett resigned his teaching position and moved to Seattle, where he opened a small appointment-only restaurant called The Hidden Palate that quickly gained a cult following among gourmands willing to pay extraordinary prices for what was described as transformative dining experiences. When Seattle police investigated the disappearance of 2 prominent business executives who had dined there, they found the restaurant closed and Burnett gone. In the basement, they discovered the familiar arrangement of hooks, drainage, and specialized implements. Among the papers found in Dr. Blackwood's quarters after his disappearance was a sealed letter addressed to those who seek understanding, with instructions that it should be opened only in the event of his death or disappearance. Marshall Wilcox broke the seal on July 15, 1883. The contents, preserved now in the archives of the New Mexico Historical Society, consist of a single page bearing these words, "She is not alone. They have walked among us for centuries, wearing our faces, learning our ways, feeding upon more than just our flesh. They take not only our bodies, but something essential within us, call it soul or spirit as you will. I feel her nature awakening within me now, a hunger that cannot be described in human terms. I struggle still, but weakly, like a drowning man whose lungs already fill with water. By the time you read this, I will either have ended my own life or begun taking others to feed what grows inside me. If the former, burn my remains and scatter the ashes in running water. If the latter, know that I am merely one of many. They are patient, they are hungry, and the feast never truly ends." The letter was signed, "No longer Edward Blackwood." The historical record shows that between 1883 and 1967, at least 27 separate incidents across the American Southwest share similarities with the events at Widow Clark's Inn. Conservative estimates suggest that over 100 people disappeared in connection with these incidents. In each case, a woman fitting the same general description established a small inn or restaurant in a remote location, operated it for a period of months, during which travelers or locals vanished, and then disappeared herself just as authorities began to investigate. What makes the Widow Clark case particularly significant to researchers of this phenomenon is the unusual amount of documentation that survived. Most similar incidents left fewer records, with investigators often disappearing themselves before completing their reports. The detailed journals of both Dr. Blackwood and Marshall Wilcox provide insights into not only the methodology of these predators, but also the process by which they appear to propagate their kind. In 1975, anthropologist Dr. Rebecca Stern of the University of Colorado proposed what has become known as the Widow-Clark hypothesis, based on her study of similar cases throughout the American West and parts of Europe dating back to the early 18th century. Dr. Stern suggested that these incidents represent the activities of a non-human entity, capable of assuming human form and transferring its nature to human hosts, through a biological mechanism she termed parasitic seeding. The consistency of the methodology across widely separated incidents and time periods suggests either a shared cultural practice or a biological imperative. Dr. Stern wrote in her controversial paper, which was rejected by mainstream academic journals but has gained a following among researchers of unexplained phenomena. The preference for isolated locations, the specialized preparation of victims, and, most significantly, the apparent transfer of the entity's nature to selected individuals who then continue the cycle, all point to a predatory species using humans as both food source and reproductive medium. Dr. Stern's academic career effectively ended with the publication of this paper in a small paranormal research journal. She left the university in 1978 to pursue independent research, focusing on historical accounts of similar phenomena in Europe. In 1982, while investigating reports from a remote village in the Carpathian Mountains, she disappeared. Her research materials, shipped to her sister in Denver shortly before her disappearance, included numerous case studies that fit the Widow-Clark pattern, some dating as far back as the 14th century. Most intriguing among these historical accounts was a Latin manuscript from 1387, written by a monk in what is now Romania, describing a noblewoman who established a hunting lodge in the mountains, where she hosted elaborate feasts for selected guests who subsequently disappeared. When local authorities eventually investigated, they found evidence of butchery and consumption of human flesh. The noblewoman escaped capture but was reported to have resurfaced decades later in Vienna, apparently unchanged in appearance despite the passage of time, where similar disappearances occurred. The monk's manuscript included a detailed description of the noblewoman's distinctive silver brooch, a hand clutching a heart, and noted that before fleeing, she had taken a young girl from the village, making a small cut in the child's arm into which she placed a seed of her own dark nature. The girl disappeared with the noblewoman, but returned to the village 20 years later, now a woman who appeared identical to the noblewoman who had taken her, wearing the same silver brooch. In Dr. Stern's notes, she theorized that what we perceive as multiple individuals matching the Widow-Clark description may in fact be successive human hosts of the same entity, with each new host taking on the physical characteristics and predatory behavior of the original. The seed, described in multiple accounts, may be a biological mechanism for transferring the entity's nature, or perhaps even its consciousness, to a new host when the current one is threatened or has exhausted the hunting potential of its territory. The 1960s excavation of the Widow-Clark Inn site yielded another piece of evidence supporting this theory. Among the artifacts recovered from the hidden chamber was a small glass vial containing what appeared to be seeds, approximately the size of apple seeds but black in color. Analysis conducted at the University of New Mexico determined that these were not plant seeds, but some form of organic material with a cellular structure unlike anything in the university's reference collection. Unfortunately, this sample was stored alongside the silver brooch that later disappeared, along with graduate student Ellen Clark. What happened to Clark remains unknown, though a restaurant called Eleanor's opened in Minneapolis in 1972, operated by a woman matching her description, where 4 patrons disappeared over a 6-month period before the establishment closed suddenly. The most recent connection to the Widow-Clark case emerged in 2010, when the Las Vegas Citizens Committee for Historic Preservation received an application for historical landmark status for the site of Widow-Clark's Inn. The application, submitted by mail, included detailed architectural drawings of the original structure and a tintype photograph, purportedly showing the inn as it appeared in 1883. The photograph depicted a two-story wooden building with a porch spanning its front, and standing in the doorway, a tall, slender woman in black, her face just slightly blurred. What made this application particularly disturbing was its timing. It arrived on the desk of the committee secretary, Maria Gonzalez, on the morning of April 17, 2010, exactly 127 years to the day after the original advertisement for Widow Clark's Inn had appeared in the Las Vegas Daily Gazette. The return address on the application belonged to an empty lot in Tucson, Arizona. The application was denied. 2 weeks later, a woman purchased property 3 miles west of Las Vegas, along what had once been the main road to Santa Fe. According to county records, she paid in cash and submitted paperwork identifying herself as Abigail Blackwood. Construction began immediately on what was described as a historical reproduction of a 19th-century inn and restaurant. When Maria Gonzalez drove past the construction site out of curiosity, she found the foundation already laid and framing underway for a 2-story wooden structure that appeared identical to the one in the tintype photograph from the landmark application. She reported feeling a profound sense of unease and chose not to stop. That evening, she emailed the County Historical Society about her concerns regarding the coincidental timing and historical connection to the Widow Clark case. The next morning, Gonzalez did not report for work. A colleague who went to her home found it empty, with dinner half prepared in the kitchen and no sign of struggle. Gonzalez has never been found. The email she sent was not in her sent folder, and no one at the Historical Society received it. Construction of the new structure was completed by June 2010, though no business license was ever issued and no formal opening was announced. Nevertheless, by August, travelers on the road between Las Vegas and Santa Fe began to mention an extraordinary restaurant at a reproduction historical inn where the food was unlike anything you've ever tasted, and reservations were required weeks in advance. By November 2010, 3 Las Vegas residents had been reported missing after mentioning to friends or family that they had reservations at that new place outside of town. When sheriff's deputies went to investigate, they found the property abandoned, with no sign that a building had ever stood there. The foundation and framing that Maria Gonzalez had seen were gone. The ground showed no evidence of recent construction, and county records contained no reference to the property purchase by Abigail Blackwood. The only indication that anything had ever existed at the site was a hand-painted wooden sign lying in the tall grass near where the entrance would have been. It read, "Widow Clark's Inn, fine food and lodging." The question that continues to haunt those familiar with the case is not simply what happened to the victims of Widow Clark and her apparent successors, but what continues to happen even now. If Dr. Stern's theory is correct, the entity that manifested as Abigail Clark in 1883 Las Vegas continues to exist, moving from host to host, location to location, adapting its methodology to changing times while maintaining the essential pattern of isolation, consumption, and propagation. In 2015, a popular food blogger wrote an enthusiastic review of a secret restaurant in Santa Fe that served the most transcendent meal I've ever experienced at a private home by invitation only. The blogger described the hostess as an elegant older woman with striking gray-streaked hair who prepared each course herself while explaining the historic and cultural significance of the ingredients and techniques. The post included a photograph of an elaborately plated main course that the blogger identified as heritage game meat with a reduction sauce I'm still dreaming about. 3 days after publishing this review, the blogger posted a brief update stating that the restaurant had contacted her requesting removal of the post, as they were a private establishment not seeking publicity. She complied. 2 weeks later, her family reported her missing after she failed to return from what she had described as a follow-up interview with that amazing chef I told you about. Her blog remains online, though the original review was indeed removed. However, Internet archiving services preserved the deleted post, including the photograph of the main course. In 2018, a forensic anthropologist who had become interested in the Widow Clark case examined this photograph and concluded that what was plated was not game meat at all, but rather human flesh, specifically from the calf muscle, prepared in a manner consistent with French culinary techniques. Yet perhaps most disturbing of all is the pattern that has emerged in the digital age. Since approximately 2005, researchers tracking possible Widow Clark incidents have noted an evolution in methodology. Rather than establishing physical restaurants or inns that might draw unwanted attention, the entity now appears to operate through exclusive supper clubs and pop-up dining experiences marketed via word of mouth and private social media groups. These events are typically described as historical dining, experiences or secret centuries-old recipes available only to selected guests who are willing to sign non-disclosure agreements and pay extraordinary prices for transformative gastronomy. The locations change frequently, as do the names associated with them, but certain elements remain consistent. The hostess or chef is invariably described as an elegant woman with prematurely gray-streaked hair. The food is described in terms of transcendent or life-changing flavor, and occasionally attendees disappear afterward. What has changed is the scale. While historical incidents typically involved multiple disappearances concentrated in a single location over months, the modern pattern involves isolated disappearances spread across multiple locations, with each dining experience occurring only once in any given venue. This approach maximizes mobility and minimizes the likelihood of pattern recognition by law enforcement. The most recent suspected incident occurred in March 2023, when a tech executive from San Francisco disappeared after telling colleagues he had been invited to the most exclusive dining experience in the country, at a private location in the New Mexico desert. His last communication was a text message, reading only, "The food here is indescribable. I'll never eat normal food again." His car was found abandoned at a trailhead near Los Alamos, with no indication of his destination or final whereabouts. Investigators found on his laptop a deleted email invitation to what was described as recreation of a historical frontier dining experience based on recipes from a legendary 19th century inn. The sender's email address was registered to a domain that had been created 1 week before the invitation was sent and was deleted 1 day after the executive disappeared. The name associated with the invitation was simply A. Clark. Despite the evolution in methodology, the fundamental nature of these incidents appears unchanged. The entity requires human hosts, prefers isolation, selects victims carefully, consumes both flesh and some less tangible essence, and perpetuates itself through seeding selected individuals who then continue the cycle. For those who have studied the Widow Clark case and its apparent connections across time, the question is not whether such an entity exists. The evidence, while circumstantial, is too consistent to dismiss entirely, but rather how many such entities might be operating at any given time, and whether they represent a single species or phenomenon, or multiple variations on a theme of predation that transcends normal human understanding. As Dr. Stern wrote in her final notes before her disappearance, if we accept that such entities exist, we must also accept that our understanding of reality, of what constitutes human versus non-human, is fundamentally incomplete. These predators do not merely feed on human flesh, but on human identity itself, wearing it like a garment while retaining their essential otherness. They walk among us indistinguishable until they choose to reveal themselves through their hunger. And most troubling of all, they multiply not through conventional reproduction, but by converting humans into beings like themselves, suggesting that whatever Widow Clark was, she was once human herself before being transformed. Yet occasionally, travelers on the lonely highways of New Mexico report seeing an old wooden building just off the road, not marked on any map, with a hand-painted sign swinging in the wind. Those who stop describe being greeted by a tall, slender woman with gray-streaked hair and strangely ageless features, who invites them in for a meal they'll never forget. Those who decline the invitation continue their journey and live to tell the tale. Those who accept are never seen again.